Hi, it's Katrina. We all love our pets, and ancient people were exactly the same. Although, while we cuddle with our dogs, they may have been cuddling with a hyena or two. Ancient civilizations were obsessed with their pets, sometimes even to the death. Get ready to explore the surprising, intense, and sometimes downright bizarre history of the pets that people had and how far they went for the animals they loved.
The sleeping dogs of ancient Egypt.
If all her dogs followed her into the afterlife, Egyptologist Dr. Mary Hartley's tomb would be more crowded than a doggy daycare on a Monday morning. As a dog lover herself, with a border collie as her most recent companion, she is the perfect person to uncover the shocking secrets of ancient Egyptian pets.
Mary loves her dogs, but did she love them as much as the Egyptians? To the people of the Nile, dogs were more than just loyal companions. They were guardians, sacrifices, and sometimes even religious merchandise. At Saqqara, a vast ancient burial ground, a stunning discovery was made: a mass tomb containing over 1,000 dogs. This find forces us to confront the complex relationship the Egyptians had with their canines, one that was both affectionate and deeply unsettling.
Let me start with the heartwarming version before getting to the gruesome stuff. Ancient people buried their beloved dogs like family. According to Dr. Hartley, the Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a place that was both magnificent and murderously dangerous.
You needed protection on the other side of life, and what better bodyguard than a loyal, four-legged friend with a bark that could chase off demons? These weren't just pets, they were metaphysical sentries. Dogs were often buried at the foot of coffins, posted at tomb entrances, or placed on the directional edges of cemeteries like some kind of spiritual security system.
As early as 4000 BC, Egyptians were sticking dogs into tombs. By 3800 BC, they were placing them at necropolis boundaries like furry little scarecrows for evil spirits. In Egypt, the dog was man's best friend and his undead bodyguard.
The rise of the votive puppy. The relationship between Egyptians and dogs stayed the same for a few thousand years until around 644 BC. By then, the dog's role had evolved, or devolved, depending on your point of view. In the last few centuries before Egypt collapsed and Cleopatra died at the fangs of a venomous snake, Egyptians became obsessed with mummified votive dogs. It was around 600 BC that funerary rites became democratized and open to the non-elite. For thousands of years, only kings and queens, wealthy aristocrats, and nobles received fancy burials. Once it became commonplace, everyone wanted in, and everyone wanted a dog to put in their new tomb. Having a mummified dog as an offering to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and protector of the dead, was everything. Prayers were attached to the dog mummy. Sometimes literal notes were buried with the pups, like spiritual post-its saying, "Hey Anubis, fix my crops," or "Please smite my neighbor's fig tree." The result of all this was a booming dog death industry. Breeding centers sprang up, canine production lines were launched, temples turned into dog sanctuaries, but then actually turned into dog slaughterhouses.
Egyptians went from loving their dogs as friends to collecting them like labubus and decorating their tombs with them.
The Wall of Bones. Between 2007 and 2010, Macquarie University students dug at Teti Cemetery North in Saqqara, led by Associate Professor Boyo Okinga. They opened 3 burial chambers and practically tripped over an avalanche of disarticulated dog remains.
Over 1,300 canines, many long-legged and greyhound-like, were found mixed with scraps of cloth, wood, and human bones. It was overwhelming, said Dr. Hartley, and yeah, I bet it was. Researchers stumbled into the dogpocalypse.
Hartley and her team sorted through the remains and selected 119 crania for further analysis. Keep in mind that these weren't lovingly wrapped mummies, just skulls and bones, bare and broken, with no clear causes of death. That said, X-rays from other dog mummies have occasionally revealed a spine-snapping clue. There seems to be a gap between the second and third cervical vertebrae with a lot of mummified dogs. And that means, unfortunately, and I really don't like saying this out loud, that the dogs likely had their necks snapped. It sounds awful, and of course it was, but it was also quick and painless.
Because while the Egyptians wanted their dogs to join them in death, they weren't cruel about it. They didn't even think it was bad. They thought they were doing everyone, themselves, Anubis, the dogs, a favor by ensuring them a spot in the afterlife.
Meet the ancient pariah dog. You're probably wondering what kind of dogs Egyptians had. Shepherds, bulldogs, chihuahuas? Morphological analysis revealed most were pariah dogs. These scrappy, semi-feral canines still prowl modern Egyptian villages today. Indian pariah dogs are the most famous. You see them everywhere, living in the streets and ambling around like they own the place. These were the hardcore street dogs of the Nile, and not at all prized for their pedigree. They were valued for their availability, and experts believe for their expendability too. When religious economy meets mass demand, sentimentality goes out the window. Egyptians loved their dogs for thousands of years. Then they started trying to keep up with their neighbors, furnish their tombs, and ensure status in the afterlife. And thus, pariah dogs became widespread as ritual offerings, not as pets, but as products.
With the practice open to the masses, the demand for dog sacrifices skyrocketed. Breeding programs were established to supply the temples, with dog farms churning out litters destined not for homes, but for tombs.
Over 1,000 years of this practice meant that millions of dogs were bred, killed, and mummified. Dr. Hartley's work shows us that behind the wrappings, under the dust and inside the ancient bones, lies a culture that wrestled with death. They loved animals, loved their pets, and loved their religion. But ultimately, like almost every society in history, they were corrupted, and their good intentions turned into something pretty much evil. Ancient Greek pets.
You're going to love the pets of the ancient Greeks. They conquered Troy, invented democracy, and birthed Western philosophy. But behind all that marble and myth was a society absolutely obsessed with pets. And not just hunting dogs, but peacocks, monkeys, and even snakes that doubled as pest control.
In Greece, the world's earliest animal lovers were naming their pups and teaching their monkeys to play the lyre.
When it came to household companions, dogs were the undisputed kings of the ancient pet scene, as you just saw with the Egyptians. Across the sea, in Greece, people also had dogs, but different dogs.
The Greeks had a canine lineup that could take down anything from wild boar to boredom. The Laconian hound was prized for its speed, the Molossian for muscle, and the Cretan for being the Swiss Army knife of dog breeds.
One legend claims a Vertragus once saved Alexander the Great from a charging elephant. What's a loyal pup if not a four-legged anti-tank missile?
Thanks to plenty of Greek texts from ancient times, historians even know what they named their dog. There was a guy called Xenophon who wrote manuals about hunting. In one of his manuscripts, he gave instructions on how to name your dog. It was the original baby names book. Xenophon insisted on short, meaningful names for dogs. Single-syllable, high-impact monikers. No Sir Fluffington III nonsense. These were sleek creatures with names like Lycos, Thronos, and when they died, their human companions grieved for them with heartfelt tombstones. One gravestone for a dog named Stephanos read, "Whom Rhodope shed tears for and buried like a human." Short and to the point, basically saying the dog meant as much to the owner as a human member of their family. Tough times may have built Greek empires, but it was this soft mourning for pets that revealed their hearts. While dogs were beloved companions, other animals played more practical, though no less vital roles in the home. And then there were the ferrets. Step foot into a Greek home 2,500 years ago, and you might step on a ferret. Tucked among the amphorae were hairy, narrow, rat-like tubular ferrets. They weren't used as fashion accessories like Cruella de Vil would probably enjoy, but as working-class heroes tackling rodent infestations. Today, ferrets might be attributed to a certain type of pet owner, but most don't realize that ferrets are ruthless, tiny, furry ninjas. They were great for keeping out rodents. And so were snakes, which were also surprisingly welcome in the home rent-free. Not because the Greeks loved a good hiss, but because these slithering roommates kept mice in check. Though keep in mind that snakes weren't named or cuddled, just respected. A live-in exterminator with no maintenance fee is hard to beat in any era. I guess they could have used cats, but this is ancient Greece I'm talking about. You know they had to use the weirdest animals available. Cats weren't quite the household icons in Greece that they were in Egypt. You won't find temples to Bastet on the Acropolis. And yet archaeological clues suggest that felines slinked their way into Greek life anyway. Native to the islands and possibly one of the oldest natural breeds, the Aegean cat evolved with no human interference. They appear to have been natural to the Aegean islands like Crete and Rhodes, and possibly Cyprus too. And the Greeks just kind of accepted them as background animals. It took the Greeks way longer than the Egyptians to let them into their house. After all, what cat wants to be roommates with ferrets and serpents? Or apes and peacocks for that matter?
Where the Greeks really went off the rails is when they invited primates to the party.
Modern pet lovers are limited by the law to what we can have, and most people stick to domesticated animals like dogs, cats, horses, maybe a rabbit, you get it. But for you exotic animal lovers, you might like to know that some ancient Greeks were keeping monkeys as personal attendants. Apes and monkeys were occasionally trained to entertain and bring you things like small children. Large birds also strutted onto the domestic scene. Herons and peacocks were considered exotic status symbols, while geese and ducks functioned as natural burglar alarms. If someone broke into a Greek home, they were greeted by squawking birds, apes playing musical instruments, and a small army of hissing snakes. Definitely helped keep home invasions down. Just like you and me, the Greeks grieved for their furry friends when they died. If your ferret passed on or your Molossian dog took his final nap, you wept. But unlike us, who might cry in the veterinarian's parking lot for 45 minutes, the Greeks cried publicly and sometimes extravagantly. Pets were often buried in marked graves, eulogized in verse, and immortalized in sculpture. It was a full-on funeral. The Greeks saw animals as companions in both life and death, reflections of loyalty, courage, and sometimes even comedy. After all, what's funnier than a monkey with a tambourine or a snake biting your uninvited guest on the ankle? So yes, while we remember the ancient Greeks for their politics, poets, and Peloponnesian battles, we should also thank them for inventing the emotional support animal. Whether they were chasing boars with a Molossian, naming their dog Titanos, or letting a goose guard the granary, the Greeks were big on their pets.
And now for the famous mummified monkeys of Egypt. But first, I want to give a shout out and big thank you to James Merrill and Jordan Escamilla for supporting this channel. Thanks so much for joining me for coffee. I love it. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this, and check out our membership program.
The mummified monkeys of ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, people loved baboons. There was a big business in capturing live baboons, but archaeologists have found evidence they didn't live very well. They were usually kept in sunless enclosures, fed poorly, and then after slowly malnourishing them to death, the Egyptians would give them the full VIP mummy treatment. A new study published in PLOS ONE peels back the bandages on 36 baboon mummies buried between 800 and 500 BC. These primates, found in the so-called Valley of the Monkeys in southern Egypt, didn't die in the wilds of East Africa like they should have. They were imported, held captive, and treated as sacred proxies of the moon god Thoth, except, without sunlight or nutrition. So you have to wonder, how did Thoth feel about his beloved baboons getting the old POW treatment? If you cringe just a little at how they were treated, it just means you're a modern human. While the Egyptians were busy spoiling their cats, baboons fell to the wayside.
Thoth was the baboon-headed deity of wisdom and lunar calendars. He commanded enough respect in Egypt to warrant the ritualistic embalming of his animal avatars. A lot of people don't know this, but nearly all the Egyptian gods had worldly avatars. Horus's avatar was the falcon, Bastet was the cat. Egyptian gods were often modeled after animals, as if they were divine hybrids.
One of the ways of venerating the gods was to mummify their animal avatars, but apparently they didn't care much for how they spent their final days. Baboons weren't living in temples dripping with gold and being hand-fed grapes. They were likely caged in high-walled enclosures that blocked sunlight and escape, simian solariums that forgot the soul part. The skeletal evidence tells the tale: bent limbs, warped spines, and deformed skulls. Advanced rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was found in most of the baboons, blatant proof that they lived without access to sunlight for extended periods. Their bones were likely bent from being stuffed into cramped cages. It's horrendous. Just so the Egyptians could offer them as sacrifices, these baboons suffered greatly. The same people that adored cats were also sadistic zookeepers.
Of the 36 mummified baboons studied, only 4 seemed relatively healthy. Researchers believe these lucky few hadn't been in captivity long enough to develop full-blown bone malformations. The rest were beyond unlucky. One of the more bizarre aspects of this whole thing is that baboons weren't even native to Egypt. They had to be hauled in from places like Nubia or even farther south along the Red Sea corridor.
The only silver lining I can give you is that the animals weren't mistreated violently. There is absolutely no evidence of broken bones or beatings. It seems that since they were exotic animals imported from faraway lands, the Egyptians just didn't understand how to take care of them. Because baboons didn't live in Egypt, Egyptians didn't realize they needed sunlight, nutrition, and space to climb, although you think it'd be logical. They definitely fed them, but they probably kept them indoors and in confined spaces, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of sheer ignorance.
According to co-author Bea de Coupere of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, of all the animals revered by the ancient Egyptians, baboons were the only ones that are not native to Egypt, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. How did they come up with the god in the first place?
In death, the baboons were finally treated like the celestial beings the Egyptians thought they were.
Each baboon was carefully wrapped, entombed, and placed in burial grounds designed for holy animals. Some were even discovered with ceremonial objects nearby, suggesting their symbolic value was immense, even if their quality of life was not.
Wim van Neer, a paleontologist involved in the study, summed up the paradox by basically saying it was the ancient Egyptian version of giving your dog a lavish funeral after forgetting to feed him for a year. The baboons of Thoth were sacred enough to be embalmed like royalty, just not sacred enough to be let outside. And now let's get the heck away from this horrible history and check out some big, cuddly grizzly bears. When grizzlies lived at the White House.
Okay, so this isn't super ancient, but it's still a good story. A president once made a huge and very hairy mistake. The most unhinged presidential pet story is about Thomas Jefferson accidentally turning the White House into a bear enclosure.
In 1807, Jefferson was gifted 2 adorable grizzly bear cubs from the American frontier. Now, who in their right mind wouldn't keep a pair of cute, cuddly bears? Especially free bears. Problem was, within months, those wide-eyed fluffballs had morphed into snarling death machines parked near the front door of the executive mansion. And things did not go according to plan. Zebulon Pike, the bear salesman.
The presidential grizzly mishap began with Captain Zebulon Pike, the army officer whose exploration of the southwestern frontier was part map-making, part imperial reconnaissance, and possibly part espionage.
While Lewis and Clark were out west politely waving at locals up in the Pacific, Pike was hiking into Spanish-controlled New Mexico under the pretense of surveying rivers. He was detained for a year, which he survived unharmed, if not slightly embarrassed. Then he returned to Washington with tales of rugged terrain, imperial dreams, and bear cubs. Pike described these mysterious grizzly bears as the most ferocious animals on the continent. He saw bears like Hannibal saw elephants, thinking they could be used as rabid killing machines for the Americans, maybe even driven forward into combat like war dogs. So what did Zebulon Pike do? He rallied a few of the grizzlies up himself and sent them to the President of the United States. Which almost sounds crazy until you realize the White House has always been a little bit nuts. And besides, this was 1807. What could possibly go wrong? The White House Bear Garden.
At first, the cubs were novelty. They were a living, snarling thank you card from Pike for Jefferson's support of his southward expedition. The president housed the bears in a cage by the north entrance of the White House, which political opponents instantly mocked as his bear garden.
That may not sound like much of an insult to you, but it was a huge insult in the early 19th century. Because in Shakespeare's day, the term bear garden referred to chaotic arenas of bear baiting and public mayhem. It was an insult meant to call Jefferson's White House a poor man's circus. But who cares what people call you when your best friends are a couple of bears? Okay, well maybe they weren't Jefferson's besties. The cubs were growing fast and were not turning out to be a pair of lapdogs. Jefferson had 2 apex predators with paws like dinner plates and a temperament describable as prehistoric fury.
Jefferson thought he was getting a petting zoo. only to realize that his cuddly gift had evolved into a liability with teeth. It quickly became clear that the bears had to go.
In came Charles Wilson Peale, a Revolutionary-era polymath who ran America's first museum. He was something of a bear enthusiast himself. You might even say he was a grizzly aficionado. Or a little bit weird. Either way, Peale had already tried keeping his own grizzly once, and it hadn't ended well. But when the president asked if Charles would take on his 2 grizzlies, he relented and agreed to adopt them. After all, Jefferson described them as perfectly gentle bears, and even if Charles hadn't wanted to, it was still the kind of request you couldn't say no to, especially if you wanted future commissions. If the president asks you to take care of his bears, you take care of his bears. Unsurprisingly, the bears didn't stay gentle for very long once they were transferred into the custody of Charles. After one of the bears threatened a member of his family, they were both promptly euthanized. I know it's an abrupt and terrible ending to the story, but it's also kind of the moral of the story. It doesn't matter if you're a president, a prime minister, or if your name is Charles. Bears are wild animals and not the best pets. Their hides were turned into taxidermy, mounted, and installed in Charles' museum. One heck of a fate for the presidential bears. This saga is more than just a cautionary tale about dangerous pets. It's a snapshot of early America in full expansionist swagger. Pike's expeditions were just scientific ventures that caught bears while also laying the groundwork for the American empire that was soon to be born. The gift of the Grizzlies, as weird as it seems, was part of a larger culture of collecting and exhibiting the exotic. This is a snapshot of early America. New lands, new peoples, new animals, all boxed up and paraded eastward like trophies for the Republic. The origin of your cat. How exactly did cats go from being wild animals to lounging on our keyboards? A new theory based on 2 recent studies suggests the origin story of the domestic cat is not as cuddly as you might think. It's a story of mass sacrifice to the Egyptian goddess Bastet. While scientists used to believe that cats were domesticated for catching mice, it appears that was just an added bonus. For decades, the prevailing theory went like this. Around 9,000 years ago, in the early farming villages of the Fertile Crescent, wild cats started hanging around grain stores. The humans noticed that the cats ate the mice. The cats noticed that the humans tolerated them. Over time, a mutual relationship blossomed into something fluffier. But Dr. Sean Doherty from the University of Exeter just hit that theory with a rolled-up newspaper. His team re-examined old evidence, bones, genomes, and iconography, and found a stark new timeline. Real domestication, they argued, didn't begin until ancient Egypt, around the 2nd to 1st millennium BC. This completely upends old beliefs, but archaeologists have only themselves to blame. It turns out that many 9,500-year-old cat bones, including some found on the island of Cyprus, were dated wrong. Because cat bones are small and difficult to analyze, scientists have been supporting a false timeline for years. This new study took a second look and confirmed that no, cats weren't pets 10,000 years ago. It wasn't until the pharaohs that kitties went from outside to inside and then back out again. In Egypt, cats were divine. Just like how baboons were the avatars of Thoth, cats were avatars of Bastet, a feline goddess who started out as a lioness of war and ended up as a purring symbol of home, fertility, and protection. Around the 1st millennium BC, Bastet's popularity exploded, and with it, the demand for sacrificial cats skyrocketed. And if this is sounding like the story of the baboons, that's because it's similar. But luckily, the Egyptians didn't keep their cats in dark dungeons. Temples dedicated to Bastet became feline graveyards. Millions upon millions of cats were bred to be ritually slaughtered, mummified, and offered to the gods. Victorian archaeologists were so overwhelmed by the numbers that they shipped literal tons of mummified cats back to Britain. And what did the British do with all of these cat mummies? Mostly they were pulverized into fertilizer. But here's the big twist. In the middle of all the sacrificing, purring, and mummification, something big was happening. The Egyptians began to selectively breed their cats. Suddenly, there were calmer cats, more tolerant of humans, and more easily handled. They survived long enough in captivity to reproduce. And this is exactly how domestication really happened. The Egyptians were so crazy to sacrifice cats that they began a breeding program that created housebroken cats. The Egyptians are why your cat is currently staring at you, wondering why you aren't feeding him. For the love of hyenas. When most people think of ancient Egyptian animals, they picture sleek cats, ibises, or the odd crocodile wearing eyeliner. But in the dusty footnotes of tomb paintings and bone pits, another creature skulks into view: the hyena. Grubby, grinning, and often misunderstood, hyenas in ancient Egypt weren't just background creatures. They didn't stalk the garbage-strewn outskirts of Addis Ababa like they do today. They were real pets, and possibly the world's least cuddly spirit guides. I mean, you could try to cuddle with a hyena, but it would probably bite your face off. If your mental image of a hyena involves a snarling mess of fur and chaos, forget everything the Lion King taught you and be surprised at ancient Egyptian tomb art. In multiple depictions found across multiple tombs, Egyptians are calmly feeding hyenas. These images often show normal people offering them hunks of meat like it's dinner with the in-laws, and they don't look particularly fearful or bothered or worried. They look like regular people feeding Rex as afternoon treats. If it was just one painting, you could chalk it up to a moment of artistic whimsy, but it's not just one, it's a bunch. The evidence suggests that hyenas were kept, fed, and maybe even fattened like poor Hansel and Gretel. But why? Whether for religious sacrifice or a very questionable entree, these animals were treated with a certain utilitarian respect. And yes, it appears that some were bred like livestock, a culinary practice that lands somewhere between innovative and I dare you to eat that. Alright, so maybe the Egyptians ate their hyenas, but they also kept them as pets. And sometimes they used them for medicine too. Egyptians weren't squeamish about animal parts, especially if those parts could heal, hex, or hasten one's entry into the afterlife. Hyenas, with their peculiar anatomy and, shall I say, potent aroma, were mined for medicinal ingredients. Organs, bodily fluids, and other hyena extracts were harvested and incorporated into ancient pharmaceuticals. It's the kind of medical practice that makes you thankful for aspirin. Still, it speaks to the Egyptians' deeply integrated worldview, in which biology, spirit, and survival all flowed through the same artery. If hyena liver helped ease your journey to the underworld, you didn't really care if the hyena was also your four-legged pal. The afterlife was the most important thing in ancient Egypt. To understand how the Egyptians viewed hyenas, you have to look at where they lived. The hyenas, I mean. The Egyptians obviously lived in Egypt. They weren't entirely wild, but not quite domestic either. Hyenas prowled burial grounds and grave edges, sniffing for decay and searching for bones to crunch on. To the Egyptian imagination, that made them natural mediums between the worlds of the living and the dead. Their eerie laughter, made famous by Disney, was thought to be something like a ringtone from the spirit realm. Their scavenging nature was, to the Egyptians, proof they dined with ghosts. It's no wonder hyenas got folded into Egyptian death lore, sometimes as protectors, sometimes as the threat. In a culture obsessed with order, hyenas were chaos, and that earned them both reverence and revulsion, and a place at the table. War dogs. Now for the part where things get truly surreal. Egyptians didn't just coexist with hyenas, they trained them to be war dogs. Old kingdom images show striped hyenas on leashes, collared like dogs, and possibly used for hunting. Imagine trying to wrangle one of those for your next duck shoot. Does a hyena roll over? Does it fetch? I don't know. The Egyptians definitely had hyenas on a leash, but whether they were for hunting, taking on long strolls beside the Nile, or sending into war, the experts aren't sure. And despite the utility and spiritual associations of these animals, Egyptians didn't exactly write love songs to hyenas. In art and folklore, they were often portrayed as vicious, cowardly, and occasionally dim. In fact, across much of North Africa and the Middle East, hyenas came to symbolize betrayal, foolishness, and dark magic. I doubt there was ever a hyena casting spells, but these tales stuck around and diminished the hyena's reputation. Even as hyenas played roles in Egyptian ritual and medicine, they remained morally suspect. Scavengers of corpses, howlers of doom, punchlines of morality tales, hyenas were a living contradiction. This was a creature you might train, use, or eat, but never, ever trust. Archaeological digs have turned up enough hyena-related artifacts to confirm their dual role in Egyptian life. Bones bearing butchery marks, tomb paintings showing captured and colored animals, and even amulets hinting at their magical reputation. These all testify to a complicated relationship between Egyptians and hyenas. Like so many things in ancient Egypt, hyenas were never just one thing. They were messengers, menaces, meals, and metaphors. Do you want one now? Thanks for watching. If you could pick one animal from today's video to have as a pet, which would it be? Egyptian dog, hyena, baboon, Greek ferret? What's your furry friend of choice? Let me know in the comments. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!